When Mara closed her eyes at night in her tiny apartment in Lima, Peru, she could still hear the echo of her classmates' laughter. At 25, she had moved across the city to chase a dream, to speak English fluently and one day share her own stories with the world. But each morning, the same question haunted her as she climbed over a pile of worn-out notebooks. How could she break through the wall of words she didn't yet understand? It started 3 years ago when she stumbled upon a video titled Learn English with Stories. Intrigued, she watched an animated sequence of a young woman exploring New York City, picking up vocabulary through everyday moments, ordering coffee, reading street signs, striking up conversations. Something clicked. Mara felt the spark of possibility, and she saved that video in her memory, an image of herself one day navigating foreign streets with confidence. But saving a spark in your heart is one thing, kindling a fire is another. Her first attempt was clumsy. She printed out simple stories, underlined new words, and tried to memorize them overnight. Her desk became a battlefield of flashcards, scribbled translations, and crumpled drafts. The words danced on the paper like elusive butterflies. Each morning, she'd promise herself, "Today, I will remember," yet by evening, her mind was as blank as the first page of her notebook. Frustrated, she nearly gave up. One rainy evening, Maria poured her woes into an online forum where fellow learners exchanged tips. There, she discovered a method called storing Learn English with Stories. Instead of isolated vocabulary drills, you immerse yourself in short, emotionally charged narratives, then revisit them at spaced intervals, allowing words to anchor themselves in the mind through meaning and feeling. The technique promised to transform passive reading into active memory. Skeptical but desperate, she downloaded a collection of 12 15-minute stories, tales of friendship, adventure, heartbreak, triumph. The first was about Aisha, a journalist from Mumbai who chases a story through the crowded alleys of Delhi. As Aisha confronted challenges, a lost notebook, an uncooperative taxi driver, Mara found herself gripping her phone, heart racing. Every time Aisha uttered a new phrase, "I'm on my way, can you help me with directions?" Mara spoke it aloud, mimicking the rhythm, the accent, the intent. That night, instead of cramming flashcards, she closed her eyes and replayed the scene of Aisha darting under a neon sign, her heart pounding against the noise of the city. When she woke up, the phrase "I'm on my way" bloomed in her mind, complete with the stress on the second syllable, just as the narrator had spoken it. It wasn't perfect, but it was there, vivid and alive. Encouraged, Mara scheduled her story immersion sessions into her daily routine. 6:30 in the morning, Story 1. Before lunch, Story 2. Evening, Review. Over the weeks, the words ceased to be strangers, they became companions on a journey. The taxi driver turned tutor, the neon sign a friend. Each story built upon the last, expanding her vocabulary in context and emotion, but it wasn't always smooth sailing. By the fourth story, about Leo, a software engineer from Sao Paulo hacking his way into a startup pitch, Mara hit a wall. The technical jargon overwhelmed her. Prototype, pitch deck, equity. Her progress slowed, and self-doubt crept back in. She replayed the story 8 times, but the words slipped through her fingers like water. She almost abandoned the series until an insight stopped her. Stories aren't just for learning, they're for feeling. That night, she closed her eyes And imagine Leo pacing in his cramped apartment, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, his palms sweating. She felt his anxiety and whispered the key phrases into the darkness, as if consoling a friend. "We need a prototype by Friday," she murmured, tasting each syllable. In the morning, she shot a text to her friend Diego back home. "I need a prototype by Friday," she wrote, and he replied, "Buen trabajo." Emboldened, Mara dove back into the stories with renewed vigor, approaching each new challenge not as a test of memory but as an invitation to empathy. If she could feel Leo's panic, she could store the technical terms like treasure. She began to annotate her scripts with doodles. A tiny rocket next to launch, a sketch of a light bulb beside idea. These visual cues fused meaning and memory, creating a tapestry of language in her mind. A month later, Maria's English had transformed. She walked into her local cafe and ordered confidently, "One medium latte to go, please." The barista paused, smiled, and replied in near-perfect English, "Sure thing. Anything else today?" The exchange felt like a small miracle. She hadn't just memorized a dialogue. She had brought a story to life in her daily world. But the real test came when she boarded the plane to London for a week-long conference on language education. As the plane descended over the rooftops of Kensington, she gripped her notebook, a journal of her storying journey. She imagined each story character beside her, Aisha giving her directions, Leo offering encouragement. With every breath of cool London air, Mara felt her own story unfolding. At the conference, she found herself in a breakout session alongside native speakers, discussing narrative techniques and teaching. When the facilitator posed a question, "How do you make language stick for your learners?" Mara's heart thundered. She closed her eyes for a split second and pictured her story collection, the underlined phrases, the doodles. Then, in clear, confident English, she answered, "I use short, immersive stories, revisited at intervals, tying each word to emotion and context." The room fell silent for a heartbeat, then broke into applause. Her words had power beyond her wildest dreams. That night, lying in her London hotel, Mara reflected on the journey. She was no longer the timid girl in Lima, drowning in flashcards. She was a storyteller, the weaver of narratives that bridged cultures and languages. Each story had stored more than vocabulary. It had stored confidence, curiosity, and courage. Back home, Mara launched her own YouTube channel, Stories That Stick, where she shares 15-minute videos, animated tales set in Casablanca, Tokyo, Dublin, each with key phrases highlighted, revisited, celebrated. Her subscribers soared to 10,000 in weeks. Comments poured in. "I finally remembered how to introduce myself. Your story of Mai in Beijing changed the way I study. I speak without fear now." In one video, she tells the story of Omar, a 30-year-old baker from Cairo who dreams of opening a cafe in New York. She writes Omar's dialogue on screen, revisits it with quizzes at 3-day intervals, and invites viewers to record themselves repeating the lines. Storing Learn English with Stories becomes not just a tagline but a movement, a community of learners who share their own voices, their own accents, their own lives. Now, at 27, Mara sits in front of her camera, the London skyline just visible through her window. She smiles, presses record, and begins her next story. In the heart of Dublin, two friends discover that learning a language is much like baking bread. Each step matters. Each ingredient adds flavor. Her script unfolds, powerful and motivational, inviting every viewer to join her journey. Because when words become stories, they become part of who you are, and there is no limit to where your voice can take you. As the camera's red light blinked, Mara felt the familiar thrill of beginning something new. She took a breath, then dove into Omar's world. In the heart of Dublin, two friends discover that learning a language is much like baking bread. Each step matters, each ingredient adds flavor. Omar, a baker from Cairo, needs his dough as he needs his phrases. Could I get a coffee, please? Where is the nearest Subway? I'd like to order 3 croissants. She pressed pause on the animation and turned to her viewers. Repeat after me, she said softly, and for the next 2 minutes, the gentle hum of her London apartment was filled with the tiny echo of thousands of learners practicing in unison. That evening, as she edited the footage, Mara reflected on how far she'd come and how far her community had grown. Comments scrolled past. Learners from Seoul, Lagos, Santiago, and Istanbul shared videos of themselves speaking Omar's lines, each with their unique accent and flair. Some stumbled at croissants, others laughed delightfully at Subway, but every one of them had recorded, shared, and celebrated their attempt. It was a tapestry of voices celebrating progress, not perfection. 2 months later, Mara introduced a new feature: live story circles every Saturday. She invited 4 subscribers to join her via video conference and share their favorite lines from the week's story. In one memorable session, Li Mai from Taipei nervously recited, "I lost my passport," from the story of Amara, a traveler in Rio de Janeiro. Her voice trembled at first, then strengthened as Mara gently corrected her pronunciation. "Try emphasizing the second syllable passport." Li Mai repeated it, more confidently this time, and the other participants cheered. The moment crystallized the power of community, strangers across continents lifting each other's voices. Back in Lima, Mara received an unexpected email. It was from the director of a community center in a low-income neighborhood, asking if Mara could host a weekend workshop for young learners whose schools lacked English teachers. Without hesitation, Mara agreed. She spent 2 days translating her animated stories into printable booklets, creating flashcards with doodles of the Eiffel Tower for a landmark, and scripting interactive role plays. On the Saturday of the workshop, she arrived at the center just as a group of 20 eager teenagers filed in. "Today," she began, "we're going on an adventure. You are all travelers in Tokyo. You will ask for ramen, buy train tickets, and yes, tell someone, where is the bathroom?" Laughter rippled through the room. She paired them up and handed out dialogue cards. One by one, pairs stepped to the front, reenacted their skits, and received applause. When a girl named Anna stumbled over ramen, the entire class echoed ramen like a chant, bridging embarrassment and learning. By the workshop's end, Mara saw something she'd longed for, eyes alight with confidence. The director later wrote, "You have given these kids more than English, you've given them a doorway to new worlds." That evening, as Mara sat back in her London flat, she realized that her journey, once confined to the cramped corners of her apartment in Lima, had rippled outward to touch countless lives. Yet she knew her own story was far from finished. On a crisp morning in September, she boarded a train from London to Edinburgh. She'd been invited to speak at a small educational conference on language innovation, a chance to share the storing stories technique with fellow teachers and technologists. As the Scottish landscapes unfurled outside the window, Mara reviewed her notes. Emotion anchors memory. Stories that stir feelings make words stick, space repetition with context. Revisit narratives at expanding intervals, multimodal cues. Combine text, audio, and visuals to engage multiple senses. Community reinforcement. Peer practice builds confidence and accountability. Arriving at the historic University Hall, she was ushered onto a stage beneath a vaulted ceiling. The audience was a blend of educators, app developers, and policymakers. With calm clarity, she spoke. When we teach isolated vocabulary, we strip words of their humanity. But when we embed language in stories of joy, of struggle, of longing, we invite learners to live those words. She played a clip of Aisha navigating Delhi, then showed data from her channel. A 40% increase in retention among viewers who practiced with her downloadable worksheets. After her talk, a developer approached. "Your approach is incredible," he said. "Imagine an app that personalizes stories based on a learner's interests, travel, cooking, entrepreneurship, automatically adjusting difficulty and scheduling repetition." Mara's eyes brightened. "Let's build it," she replied. Over the next 6 months, she collaborated with a small team to launch StorySpark, an app that curates micro-stories each 5 to 10 minutes long, tailored to users' goals. Adventurers got tales of hiking the Andes. Foodies received narratives about street markets in Bangkok. Entrepreneurs followed startups in Nairobi. Each story came with integrated flashcards, audio playback, and progress tracking. The app launched with a live event in Lima Central Plaza. Mara, now 28, stood before a stage flanked by giant screens. On one screen, the animated characters danced. On the other, live user testimonials played. She introduced StorySpark to a cheering crowd. "This is more than an app, it's your passport to new stories, new words, new possibilities." She tapped her phone, and the plaza erupted in confetti as fireworks spelled out "Vamos." In the Peruvian night sky. In the weeks that followed, downloads soared. Schools in Madrid, Cape Town, and Jakarta signed up for institutional licenses. NGOs in refugee camps in Jordan used StorySpark to teach displaced children basic English. Learners posted videos of themselves reciting storylines on social media, tagging #StorySpark, #stories that stick. Mara's method. One morning, an email arrived from the British Council. They invited Mara to advise on a global initiative to integrate storytelling into language curricula. She accepted, humbled by the opportunity to influence educational policy on an international scale. Now, as she reflected on her bedroom in Lima, her first studio where she'd recorded shaky videos on her phone, Mara understood that every flashcard she'd tossed, every frustration she'd weathered, had led her here. Stories had saved her from the tedium of rote memorization and, in turn, had given her a mission: to ensure no learner ever felt alone in the labyrinth of language. Mara closed her eyes and heard those early echoes of laughter in her mind, the laughter of her classmates in Lima, now distant but never forgotten. She opened her eyes to a world where every "could you please" and every "thank you so much" carried the weight of connection across cultures. Her story and the stories of learners everywhere continued to unfold, one memorable phrase at a time. Mar's flight to Amman arrived just before dusk. As she watched the Jordanian desert's ochre dunes stretch beneath her, she thought of the children in the Zatari camp, clutching their borrowed tablets and replaying her stories. In the glow of solar-powered lamps, it was here that she would pilot a new initiative, Voices Unbound, a program that empowers refugee youth to write and record their own micro-stories in English and Arabic, weaving their experiences of loss and hope into lessons for the world. On her first night in camp, Mara sat cross-legged under a tent strung with fairy lights. 20 young writers gathered in a circle, their notebooks held close. She began by sharing her own earliest scribbles from Lima, tales of a girl too shy to speak a single English phrase. Then she passed the notebook around, inviting each participant to read a line. When a boy named Sammy whispered, "My grandmother teaches me to press dough like pressing words into my heart," the tent fell silent, and Mara felt a familiar surge of wonder. Here, too, were stories that could bind language to lived experience. Over the next week, Mara guided workshops on narrative structure, beginnings that hook, middles that reveal, endings that linger. She taught them to pair new vocabulary, shelter, journey, belong with concrete images from their camp. The canvas walls, the distant call to prayer, the laughter around a shared meal. Each teen selected a phrase to practice aloud, then recorded it on their phones. By the end of the week, the program had produced 10 two-minute stories, complete with subtitles and illustrations sketched by the participants themselves. When the Voices Unbound anthology launched online, it went viral. Thousands of learners worldwide clicked to listen, fascinated by the cadences of Arabic-inflected English and the honesty of each narrator. Comments glowed. "Your story made me cry. I've never heard English used like this before. You've given me the courage to share my own words." Mara realized that storytelling didn't just teach language, it fostered empathy, connecting hearts across borders. Back in London, she convened a remote meeting with curriculum designers from the British Council and the Jordanian Ministry of Education. They discussed scaling Voices Unbound into classrooms, integrating the refugee stories alongside classic English literature. The goal was ambitious: to create a syllabus where Shakespeare's soliloquies shared space with Sammy's narrative of displacement, where Dickens's London paralleled the tent city, each illuminating the other. Meanwhile, StorySpark continued to evolve. The development team had integrated AI-driven recommendations so that if a learner struggled with prepositions of place, the app would cue a story set in a Paris caf full of, on the left, next to, behind, and follow up with focus drills. They also added community hubs where small groups could discuss story themes live, over audio chat, supporting one another as they practiced. In November, Mara returned to Lima for her grandmother's 80th birthday. The city sparkled with holiday lights, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted chestnuts. At the family gathering, her cousins crowded around her phone, marveling at the Voices Unbound videos. Her grandmother, whose gentle voice had been the first to cradle Mara's Spanish lullabies, reached out and squeezed her hand. "You have taken our stories farther than I ever dreamed," she said, tears in her eyes. That winter, Mara found herself invited to Textenberg. On stage, under a spotlight, she wove the narrative of her journey, from the cramped apartment in Lima to the animated landscapes of StorySpark, from the dusty tents of Zatari to the polished halls of academic conferences. She demonstrated how a single 15-minute story could catalyze vocabulary retention, cultural awareness, and global solidarity. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Afterwards, a student ambassador approached. "Your work inspired my research," she said, presenting a paper on narrative cognition in second language acquisition. Mara realized that her method was spawning new scholarship, rippling outward in ways she'd never imagined. As the seasons turned, Mara refocused her energies on teacher training. She partnered with UNESCO to host virtual masterclasses for educators in remote regions: rural Nepal, the Australian outback, the Amazon basin, equipping them to craft local stories that teach English through the prism of community life. Each month, teachers submitted their own microstories: a fisherman in Vanuatu describing the tides, a librarian in rural Romania spelling out "book" beneath candlelight, a Maasai herder in Kenya teaching grass, cattle, dusk. Mara and her team curated these into a global library of 500-plus stories, freely accessible to any learner with an internet connection. One spring morning, she received a message from a former student in Lima. "Mara, I'm now an English teacher at my old school. I use your stories every day. Today, I heard my students speak in English for the first time. I saw their smiles." In that moment, Mara felt the full circle of her mission. The timid learner had become the confident teacher. At T29, Mara paused to reflect on nearly a decade of growth. She sat at her desk in London, the skyline shimmering in the amber light, and opened a fresh document for her next big project, a book called Stories That Carry Us, blending theory, methodology, and a treasury of sample narratives. She envisioned chapters on cognitive science, language pedagogy, multimedia integration, and global case studies, each anchored by vibrant personal accounts from learners and teachers alike. As she typed the prologue, she thought of all the voices threading through her story: Aisha in Mumbai, Leo in Sao Paulo, Omar in Cairo, Sami in Zatari, and the countless learners in Lima, London, and beyond. Each had shown her that language is more than words. It is the vessel for human experience. Closing her laptop, Mara leaned back and looked toward the horizon where the sun was setting. She knew her journey would never truly end, because as long as there were stories to tell, there would be new words to learn, new worlds to explore, and new connections to forge. And so, with a heart full of hope and a mind buzzing with possibilities, she whispered to herself, "Let the next story begin." Months later, as the manuscript for Stories That Carry Us neared completion, Mara found herself waking before dawn, the kettle's whistle a gentle invitation. In the quiet of her flat, she reread passages describing teachers in Nepal guiding students through rhymes set to mountain breezes, and librarians in Romania whose candlelit readings wove new English phrases into tales of local folklore. Each story felt like a heartbeat, proof that language, once alive in one place, could pulse elsewhere, uniting distant lives with common breath. One morning, an email arrived from the CEO of a small tech incubator in Nairobi, proposing a collaboration. They wanted to integrate StoreSpark's library into a low-bandwidth platform for learners in rural East Africa. Mara imagined children under acacia trees, tapping simple phones to hear stories of Kenyan entrepreneurs, then practicing "I have an idea" as birds called overhead. She replied with excitement, and within weeks, a pilot launched in Maasai. villages, complete with solar-powered listening stations and paper-based companion booklets. On the day of the pilot's first class, Mara joined over video. She watched as a young boy named Juma pressed play on his device. The story began. In a small hamlet by the Serengeti, Asha dreams of photographing wildlife and speaking with tourists. As Asha hesitated over photograph, Juma repeated after her photograph and his sister giggled with pride. Mara's eyes welled with tears. This was story-powered learning in its purest form. Words carried across sky and sand, landing softly in eager hearts. That evening, she drafted an afterword for her book, reflecting on the journey from her shy beginnings in Lima to the vibrant classrooms of Cape Town, from animated London studios to tents under Jordan's desert stars. She wrote about the beauty of multilingual empathy, that by telling stories in English infused with local voices, learners everywhere could glimpse each other's worlds, one phrase at a time. As winter gave way to spring, Mara embarked on a book tour. In Tokyo, she spoke to teachers eager to craft microstories about cherry blossoms and subway etiquettes. In Sao Paulo, she joined a podcast where listeners called in to recite lines from her early videos, their Portuguese accents coloring each English syllable like a new melody. In Sydney, she led a workshop for Indigenous educators, exploring how Dreamtime stories could introduce phrases like thank you and good morning through oral tradition. Everywhere she went, she carried with her a small notebook, the same one she'd used in Lima, now bulging with scribbles, doodles, and tickets from Longago trips. In its pages, she found reminders. The neon sign in Delhi, the smell of fresh croissants in Dublin, the laughter under Lima's fairy lights. Each memento anchored a lesson. That words are fragile until they are lived, that confidence blooms when we dare to speak, that learning is a journey best traveled with others. Back home in London, as cherry blossoms blossomed outside her window, Mara sat at her desk and opened her email. A message from a former refugee learner in Jordan described how her Voices Unbound story had won a youth poetry competition. Now she stood on stage reading her own poem in English and Arabic. Another email from a teacher in rural Mexico shared photos of students acting out scenes from StorySpark stories, complete with homemade props and broad smiles. Mara realized that her method had become more than a learning tool, it was a bridge for dreams. In classrooms, cafes, refugee camps, and online communities, learners weren't simply absorbing vocabulary. They were sharing fragments of their lives, weaving a global tapestry of human experience. One warm evening, as she gazed at the London skyline, the domes of St. Paul's, the silhouette of the Shard, Mara contemplated what lay ahead. She envisioned a future where every learner could tell their tale. A fisherman's son on an Indonesian island narrating waves and nets in clear English, a teenage baker in Prague explaining dough and yeast with newfound pride, a retired teacher in Manitoba describing snowflakes and mittens with simple, confident speech. She imagined StorySpark evolving into a platform where voices rippled outward endlessly, where stories nested within stories like matryoshka dolls, each opening to reveal new words, new hopes, and new connections. And she knew that, although her journey had brought her across continents and into countless lives, the next chapter awaited just beyond the horizon of every fresh sunrise. With that thought, Mara closed her notebook and rose from her desk. She stepped onto her balcony, breathing in the evening air scented with wisteria. Somewhere, a learner was practicing thank you for the first time. Somewhere else, a teacher was crafting a story to inspire. Mara lifted her arms as if to embrace the world, her heart full of voices both heard and unheard. Let every story be a spark, she whispered, and every spark a flame. Then, with a steady smile, she turned back inside, ready to pen the next story and to watch as, somewhere out there, it took flight in 1,000 curious hearts.